I first started thinking about freedom as a teenager. I think it came down to a conversation I was having with a friend of mine. I was about 13 years old, and we were walking back from school together, and we were debating religion, actually. He was very religious, and I hadn't been raised in a religion. And during the course of this discussion, an idea pops into my head, and the idea was that had my friend been swapped at birth with another baby and raised in a totally different religion, he'd now be defending that particular religion with the same passion and loyalty that he was defending his current beliefs with. And I thought, wow, this is an interesting idea. And so I presented the brief thought experiment to him, and I thought maybe it would have an impact. It didn't have an impact on him, and I think we ended up talking about other topics. But as we parted ways and I walked home, I realized that the same logic applied to me, that so much about my own identity was a product of these forces that I didn't control. That had I been swapped at birth with a baby in a different family, in a different culture, in a different nation, at a different time in humanity's history, I could have become so many different things. I could have believed so many different things. I could have fought for so many different goals and held different values. And so in a deep, profound sense, I suddenly viewed my identity as something that was quite arbitrary. It created this emotional distance between who I was and I suppose who I wanted to be. It concerned me that I hadn't created myself. And if that was the case, in what sense could I truly be free? In what sense could any human being be free? We all take for granted our identity, and that's our starting point, and we go off into the world. But if you take a step back and you look at the process that leads to the formation of an identity, it raises all sorts of questions. And a few of our speakers tonight will be talking about the very difficult experiences they've been through. But I came at this question of freedom from a slightly different angle. I'd had the most stable, loving upbringing that you could have. I was very fortunate. And thinking about the arbitrary nature, the lottery of our birth, really led to me dwelling on my privilege, on how lucky I had been, and actually the decisive role of luck in everyone's life. It was only luck that separated me from the child who was living in a war zone, or the child who was being abused, or had a debilitating disability or injury. And so this really began to shape my thinking. It completely changed the way I thought about the world and about myself and about choices. And it had lots of repercussions, one of which was, not only is our world incredibly unjust, but we use freedom as a way to legitimize that injustice. We like to hold people responsible for the outcomes in their life. We're taught to think in that way. So we celebrate the rich and the wealthy and the powerful for achieving great things in their life. And we're taught to certainly be upset and regretful about the poverty that exists, and the fact that there are homeless people, and that many people in the world have to go without fundamental resources. But still, I think shaping our thinking and our response to the injustices in the world is this idea that we're truly responsible for our choices, that we're truly responsible for our outcomes. And this seemed grossly unjust. It seemed to me that whether you end up in a cell in a prison or whether you're a judge, ultimately, it's going to be reducible to forces that you didn't control. And of course, we all make choices, but we make choices with a brain that we didn't choose, a brain that has been shaped by these numerous factors, which start from the first moment of our existence in this life, which shape our identities, which shape our values. And of course, our choices in our life then reflect that shaping. They reflect our identity. They reflect the brain that develops over time. And after a while, I asked myself, well, if I didn't shape my own identity, then who did? Like, if I didn't create myself, what forces were responsible? And it led me on this journey trying to understand the society that I'd grown up in. That to truly understand the self, you had to understand the world that had given birth to the self, that had shaped and molded the self. And this led me on a quest to understand the political system and education system and economics, and also to look over history. And as I looked over history, there's at the various cultures that existed and the various systems that we've had, a clear pattern emerged that in general, identities are shaped to serve the interests of those who get to do the shaping. That were shaped to fit within a particular society at a particular time, to meet the needs of that system. And I felt that very keenly in school, in the classroom. What was I being prepared to do? Was I being prepared to understand the world and play my role in changing it and shaping it? Certainly not. There was at no point in my education did I hear the word capitalism. Did I learn about power, concepts like power, control, about the history of my nation and terrible things it had done, the British Empire, and really cruel and horrendous foreign policy that really marks our history. So that played no part in my education. I was being trained to fit into the system as it was, certainly not to change it. And so that was clear, but also what seemed clear to me was that the way we're shaped to think about freedom in terms of free elections, free markets, and a free media is also, in a way, to legitimize and to kind of pull a veil over the injustices at the heart of our society. If you believe you live in a free society, you're much more tolerant of great disparities of wealth. You're far less likely to rebel, to join together and to fight and try to change things. So I began to see the forms of freedom that are prevalent, that freedom was a mask in society, which was used to conceal a very unjust, a very unsustainable, a very unequal society. And that when you peel away this mask, not only do you find all forms of discrimination based on skin color, based on gender, based on sexuality and ability, you also find the most incredible disparities of wealth and opportunity. So to just throw one statistic which I can't quite shake from my mind. Currently 1% of humanity control as much wealth as the other 99% combined. In the UK, it's the top 10% own as much as the other 90% combined. And again, behind this mask, we find an economic system whose sole purpose is really to accumulate wealth and, for those who participate in it, to pursue profit. To such an extent that we are now destroying the conditions for our existence on this planet. And so the rhetoric of freedom, although it's prevalent, although, because it's such a powerful idea and ideal, it's been co-opted by numerous leaders, numerous political forces. Actually, what we see is we don't see a free society. We see very sophisticated mechanisms of control which work at various levels to undermine freedom, to shape identities in such a way that people become more compliant, they lack the confidence to stand up, they become more individualistic, so they're less effective. There are these divide and rule strategies. It starts in school where we're taught to obey and work on problems that have little relevance or interest to us. And it continues all the way through our professional life where we enter these institutions of rigid hierarchies where, again, obedience and conformity are key if we're going to succeed within those hierarchies. So I spent a long time thinking about the various limitations in our freedom, and there are many. And it starts, from our biology and goes all the way through to our political and economic systems. But it doesn't end there, because I think there's a positive to be taken from all this. To understand the limits on our freedom it empowers us to transcend those limits. It gives us the best chance of transcending those limits. So I want to talk about really how we maximize the freedom that is available to us. How we actually say, look, to take freedom for granted is to extinguish the possibility of attaining it. And so really, the more we focus on the limitations, I think the more grateful, the more appreciative we become of the freedom that is available, the freedom to make a choice. It seems to me that we should really view each choice as a creative act, as a way to interrupt history, send it in a slightly different direction. That each of our choices sends ripples into the world, and those ripples continue in ways that we don't fully understand, and they will continue, long after we are gone. And more than ever now, looking at the state of the world, looking at the various multiple crises we face, from the environmental crises to the democratic, the level of inequality, the refugee crisis, and on and on. I think collectively we really have to take seriously this power that we have to make choices, to actually affect change, to interrupt, for others, but also for ourselves, interrupt our patterns of behavior and thought. Because if we reproduce the same patterns that we have been taught to observe, we're going to reproduce the same kind of outcomes. We're going to continue down the path that we're on. And so part of really appreciating and taking seriously this power to make choices, to hold the choice as a sacred thing, I think is to interrogate our own conditioning, is to interrogate what has been passed from generation to generation and molded our identity, and decide, well, what is of value and what is not of value? What is truth and, what is false? And then really to act on it. And we'll never know quite what the outcome will be. As an individual, you never know the ultimate impact of your choices. But I'm always reminded and encouraged by the beautiful words of a historian called Howard Zinn, who I interviewed for a film a while ago. And he's just such a wonderful man, and he was an activist and lived through very interesting times. And his view of freedom, and I'll leave you with this, comes down to really living now as we think humans should live, in spite of all that is bad around us. Because that in itself is a marvelous victory. And that thought I always come back to, and for me, that's a positive notion of freedom that keeps me going and inspires me. Thank you.